Good morning and welcome to What's Up with Power. We are happy to have you here this morning live. We may be having some Facebook Live issues this morning. We were live on Beam, YouTube, Twitch. We will hopefully get this recording up on Facebook afterwards. We're sorry for those difficulties, but technology is technology, and apparently it's getting the better of us this morning. But we do have our guest presenter, and we do have the content, but we won't be letting you down on that. But here we go. The group ride is starting. We've got Mr. Nate Dunn with Data Driven Athlete here with us this morning. Nate, how you doing?
Good morning, doing well.
Awesome. We are happy to have you on again. So we're going to be talking about strengths and weaknesses, power profile, and Nate knows so much more than me. I'm just going to get off the screen and let him go to town, and he'll just tell me when to change the slides.
Yeah, thanks again, Justin, for having me on, and happy to be back. Today we're going to be talking about strengths and weaknesses, kind of using some of the primary Training Peaks tools. And how I like to start a lot of these is we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds today. So we're going to try and have a balance between concepts and weeds. How I like to start a lot of these. If you have any questions, we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds today. Want to get a little bit more specific. Feel free to let those concepts and weeds. How I like to start a lot of these. If you have any questions, we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds today. Get a little bit more specific. We're going to be using two primary tools, and that is the Training Peaks Power Profile Chart, and then we're going to look really briefly at the WKO4 power duration curve. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just kind of introduce that a little bit as an option if you're wanting to drill down into your strengths and weaknesses. So after we take a more specific look at those tools, then we're going to kind of try and answer this question, so what? So you've identified some strengths and weaknesses, and then what do you do with that information? So that's kind of going to be a brief outline of how we'll tackle today. So next slide, please. So a few caveats, right? Power profiles are just tools. So there's a temptation to look at these and to get really wrapped up in where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are. How does that define me as a cyclist? How does it define my value as a person? And it's important to remember that this is just one tool to assess your strengths and weaknesses and to potentially maybe guide some training decisions or racing tactics. So it might be meaningful, it might not be meaningful. So it's important to know, again, right, that these types of power profile charts or anything that compares you to other riders or compares your strengths and weaknesses, they don't define your chance for success. It's just a way to kind of shake down all of your data and to come up with some possible insights. So might be useful, might not be useful. Don't get wrapped up in making direct comparisons between yourself and other riders. The next slide, please. So the power profile chart really is built on looking at assessing your duration, your power duration over a couple different pieces, right? So we're going to break this down. This is from the Training Peaks power profile chart that you would see in your Training Peaks account. And on the bottom line, or on the horizontal axis, you have different durations. So this is not exactly how it looks like in Training Peaks. I've made some edits here so you can see it a little bit better on your screen. But along the bottom, we have a 5-second duration, 1 minute duration, 5 minute, 20 minute, and 60 minute, right? So that's along the horizontal axis. Along the vertical axis, we have some competitive labels here. And this is where there's some debate in terms of whether or not this is really useful to you. And the reason for this is that this could vary based on the region that you race in. So you might be in a region of the US, or it might be that these categories don't even apply to you if you're in another country. But regionally, these can vary as well. So there's a lot of kind of wiggle room in terms of whether or not these competitive labels that USA Cycling uses to categorize riders is meaningful at all. But since many of us participate in USA Cycling races, we've got it on here just to kind of serve as a benchmark. So you can either have these category labels, or you can also have other labels that Training Peaks will show you as good, fair, and so you can use either one of those systems. But we've kind of stuck with the USA Cycling labels just for illustrative purposes. So bottom line, we have duration. Top, we have competitive levels in cycling. And really what this power profile chart is looking to do is it's looking to identify strengths across several different energy systems, right? So 5 second, we have a look at your neuromuscular power. 1 minute, thereabouts. And again, there's variance in terms of, these aren't specific hard targets, but it gives us kind of a basic idea of looking at some of your different strengths. So 1 minute is what we classically define as your anaerobic power. 5 minute thereabouts, around there in terms of your power at VO2 max. And then we have kind of between 20 minute and 60 minute where we have lactate threshold, endurance, and that's kind of the area that we look at there. So that's what the power profile chart is looking to identify from your data. So let's go to the next slide, please. So there's some more specific ways you can break this down, but in general, the power profile chart is helping to identify three different primary cycling types, and that's a sprinter, time trialist, and then all-rounder. So a lot of us, we like to, when we're on a ride or on a race, we say, I'm not a very good sprinter, or I don't really time trial that well, or whatever. And this power profile chart, for most of you, is likely probably kind of confirming what you've already thought, where if you've been at the end of a group ride and you notice that riders are kind of blowing your doors off in the final 150 meters, that you might say to yourself, I don't think I sprint that well. And the power profile chart can help to maybe highlight what some of these strengths and weaknesses are, and then to also maybe in some ways help kind of target what type of rider you might be. But another important caveat about this is that it assumes, again, that you're very highly trained and that you've maybe maximized some of these different specific durations. So if you're a new cyclist, the reason why you might be getting blown out at the end of a race might not have anything to do with your sprint ability. It might be that you're just not that well trained and you're really fatigued, right? Or conversely, if you're a really good sprinter, but you're not time trialing that well, it might be that you're just, again, not that well trained. So it's important to look at these and to look at the limitations of them and to not kind of pigeonhole yourself in one area of cycling and say, this is me, this is all I do well, and to kind of look at the broader picture. The next slide, please. So a little bit difficult to see here, but hopefully you can see kind of the primary shape of this. But this is a power profile chart of a sprinter, right? And it's pretty intuitive. You can see that the duration that they have the greatest strength at is the 5 second duration. So this rider's ability to produce neuromuscular power is really their greatest strength. And this downward sloping shape of the curve is what traditionally identifies a really good sprinter, right? Next slide, please. So second one, right, again, pretty intuitive. We have greatest strength being in that 5 minute, 20 minute, and probably as the cyclist continues to train more, stretching out that duration closer to 60 minutes. And then they're comparably pretty weak when it comes to neuromuscular power and anaerobic capacity. So this is somebody who can time trial really well. And this kind of leveling off shape or kind of plateau shape of the power profile chart is what we identify classically as a time trialist. So next slide, please. So the next one is, again, what you would expect from an all-rounder. They kind of do everything pretty well, but they don't do anything really, really well. So usually an all-rounder is somebody that can, hang in a criterium. They can put up a decent TT. They can, do pretty well in road races. It's a rider that, their greatest strength in a lot of races is to try and get in a breakaway. But they don't have one area that they're really excelling at. And oftentimes when you're a new rider, this might be the power profile kind of curve that fits you because you have yet to really hash out some of these durations. And just to kind of get back to one of our original caveats with the power profile chart is that this really depends on good data, right? So if you have not gone maximally over one of these durations, then obviously that's not going to show up on the chart and it might not be showing your true strengths and weaknesses. So we have to assume that your power meter is accurate, and that also whatever duration that you're tracking, that you've actually given a true maximal effort over that duration to really be able to draw many conclusions from that. So remember that whether or not you're looking at the the sprinter type or the time trialist or the all-rounder, that you have to look at this and say and think to yourself, have I actually done a maximal effort over 5 seconds, over 1 minute, over over 20 minutes? And only if you've kind of met those conditions, I think, can you really make any type of determination about how these might define your strengths or weaknesses. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we're not going to spend, again, a lot of time on the WKO4 approach to accomplishing this same task. But what the WKO4 model is doing is that it's using this relationship between intensity and duration to highlight your strengths and weaknesses. So same thing that the Training Peaks Power Profile chart is doing. It's just doing it in a little bit more of a granular way and a little bit different perspective. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is the same rider that we've looked at before. This is our sprinter type, right? So downward sloping curve. We have this rider's greatest strengths being in that 5-second duration. So I wanted to give that to you for kind of comparison purposes. And then if we go to the next slide, and again, not easy to see a lot of detail, I'm sure, with your screen, but just wanted to give you some perspective. So this is the WKO4 power duration curve that's accomplishing this same the same goal of identifying strengths and weaknesses. So along the bottom or horizontal axis, we have duration. So we have ride duration as it's going from left to right. And then on the vertical axis, we have intensity. So duration intensity relationship, and then we have this power curve. And in this instance, again, you're seeing the same thing where you're seeing high level of explosive power. So on the intensity axis, we're seeing a really good ability to produce power over short durations, and then we're seeing that curve begin to come down. And this is really a more specific look that gives you an ability to not just look at maybe primary durations of 5 seconds or 1 minute, but to kind of look at every single point along that power duration curve. So if you're wanting, a much more granular look at strengths and weaknesses, the WKO4, software can give you that ability. It can also be, a little bit overwhelming in that it doesn't filter out a lot of the noise like the Training Peaks Power Profile chart does, but that is an option if you're wanting to take a little bit closer look at identifying strengths and weaknesses, and it will it will lead you to the same place, just with a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. So we look at all this and we say, so what, right? So you've identified your strengths and weaknesses, and you say, I think I'm a time trialist, or I'm a sprinter, or whatever. So what do you actually do with that information? And so we're going to look at these specifically, looking at a power profile chart. But the first thing is it helps to provide context for your goals. Second one, it helps to really inform your race tactics. And then to an extent, it can help to guide your training decisions. So we're going to break that down looking at a power profile chart in terms of how you might do that. So the next slide, please. So for this power profile chart, this athlete, we trust that they have accurate data coming from their power meter, that they've done maximal efforts over these different durations. So we can look at this power profile chart and we can say, hey, this is a pretty good representation of this rider. So first of all, goals. So if this rider says, hey, you know what, I'm really interested, I want to win the state crit championship, right? Maybe that's what their goal is. They state that at the beginning of the year as they're planning their training. Well, we look at this power profile chart and we say, well, you know what, a state crit championship, that might not be the best goal for you to target, right? Your 5-second power is comparably pretty low to the rest of your strengths. Now that doesn't mean that you might not be able to win that race. There's a lot of other tactical options that you might be able to employ to still win that race. But if that's one of your stated goals, and if you're planning your whole season around it, you might say, how has that race been won in the past? Is it usually won in a breakaway? Does it usually come down to a bunch sprint every single year? Okay, well, if it comes down to a bunch sprint nearly every single year, and if there's not a very good opportunity for a time trialist type to win the race by initiating a breakaway or a solo attack, then maybe we would shift that goal setting and we'd say, hey, you know what, maybe the state crit championship, maybe that's not the best the best goal to set for you, why don't we look for another type of race? A time trial is an obvious answer, but maybe another type of a road race, or maybe even another type of criterion that helps to highlight this rider's strengths. So that's one example of how you might be able to look at the power profile chart and help to guide your goals and to say, is this realistic? Is this not realistic? And I've also found in working with a lot of athletes that this power profile chart in Training Peaks is usually pretty dead on when it comes to lining up where these different power durations settle when it comes to your competitive level. So if you're wondering about, hey, how would I hang in a Cat 3 crit or in a P12 crit or whatever? Again, this isn't going to give you all the information. It doesn't tell you about things like riding efficiently in a pack and cornering well and making good tactical decisions. It doesn't give you that, but it does give you a pretty good overview to say, hey, if I want to ride at this level, or if I want to eventually get an upgrade, this is probably a pretty good direction, a pretty good ballpark in terms of what I need to do to get there. So the next one, tactics, right? So kind of working on that same thing we talked about with goal setting, is that if you're a time trialist and you're in a flat criterion, and if your objective is to win the race, then the worst tactical decision you could make would be sitting in and waiting for the end of the race. And I see this with riders all the time. They don't sprint well. They've never sprinted well or never even competed in a bunch sprint. And yet every single criterion that comes along, they sit in and they wait for the bunch sprint, right? So this power profile chart can really help to kind of, bring reality to the forefront and say, you don't sprint well. What are you doing sitting in? You need to attack, you need to attack, you need to attack. You need to try and plan your race strategy and your tactics to help to highlight the fact that your greatest strength is kind of that 5-minute to 20-minute power duration. So you really need to get off the front of a race and have a chance to time trial if you're going to win. If you're sitting in the pack and waiting for the finish, that's not going to be an effective way to win a race. And so the third one, training, is that this is where I think it can get complicated. I think the tendency often is to look at a power profile chart like this and to say, hey, my 5-second sprint isn't very good. I should invest a lot of my time in improving my 5-second sprint. But I think the mistake in doing that is in recognizing that 5-second sprint power is more than anything, it's coming from your genetics. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to sell out all of your training to try and tackle a weakness in your cycling, when in reality, there's probably not a whole lot of fruit to be gained from attacking that 5-second duration. So you might be able to tweak that a little bit. You might be able to make some minor improvements to that 5-second power, but to build a training program around targeting your weaknesses, I don't think makes a lot of sense. I think it makes more sense to really keep an eye on where your strengths are and continue to train those strengths, while also keeping an eye on your weaknesses and saying, how might I be able to address these in different periods of training throughout the year without severely compromising what my greatest strength is, which is, in this rider's case, time trialing. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So to kind of give a summary view of these different pieces, the power profile chart can help us create realistic goals. It can help apply our strengths and weaknesses to tactics. Now, we didn't get into this a whole lot, but in the Training Racing with a Power Meter book, you can get even more specific with power profiling. We kind of took the larger kind of 20,000 mile view look at 20,000 foot view of your training. But if you want, you can break out some of these durations even more specifically to help plan tactics. So in that chapter in that book, they talk about fatigue profiling and not just looking at your sprint, but maybe looking at your sprint over 30 seconds, over 15 seconds, over 5 seconds. And if you really, really want to take a closer look at tactics, power profiling can help you, look even more specifically and drill down even more specifically about what your strengths are. And that's kind of where that WKO4 can be really helpful, in that you can drag your mouse over an entire duration and look at not just 5 seconds, but look at maybe 10 seconds or more specific durations. And then again, like we just mentioned, in terms of directing your training, don't sell out your training just to improve your weaknesses. You want to make sure that you're regularly assessing the cost and benefit of your training decisions. So if you do come to the conclusion that you want to spend some time on your 5-second power, make sure that you're tracking what that actually means. If you spend 5 weeks doing a lot of sprint work, did you get any benefit from that? What did that do to your power at lactate threshold? What did that do to your strength, which is time trialing, when you spend all this time, spending sprint work, did it make any, did it make any difference? And then use that information going forward to say, hey, you know what? My sprint just sucks. It's not going to get that much better. I'm better off doubling down and investing more time and improving my power threshold. That might be the decision that you make, but at least make sure that you're tracking all of that information to make sure you can make a good decision. And to kind of further illustrate this point, go to the last slide, please. The tendency, again, in power profiling is to look at this stuff and to say, oh, I have a weakness in my neuromuscular power or my anaerobic capacity, or maybe to some extent my VO2 max. And it's important to remember that at the end of the day, cycling is an aerobic sport. And that if you were to do anything, if you were to spend all of your time trying to improve your power at threshold, that would probably be your best training decision, rather than to get kind of distracted by saying, I'm going to do a little bit of this, I'm going to do a little bit of this, I'm going to do a little bit of this. Is that at the end of the day, whether or not you're a sprinter, sprinters still have to ride 40 minutes in a really aggressive criterion. Road racers, whether or not they have a really high VO2 max or not, they're going to have the endurance to be able to last to the end of a 2, 3, 4-hour road race, right? So remembering that power profiling can be useful, it can help to identify strengths and weaknesses, but don't lose sight of the fact that that investment in power at lactate threshold is still your greatest tool to progress in cycling and to be more competitive, while still kind of sharpening or utilizing some of these strengths or weaknesses that are identified in the power profile chart. So we can go to the last slide, and then Justin can kind of lead us into any Q&A if there's any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nate. I'm back here on the screen. I want to let everyone know if you've got questions, let them fly in Facebook or on Discord. I will eventually get set up to take questions from Beam, YouTube, and Twitch as well. But for right now, today that's what we'll be taking questions from. Great presentation, actually. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed you said, Nate, was along the lines of, this doesn't take into account how well you corner, how well you know when to sit in, when to attack. And I think those are some of the things that maybe we overlook, and that we learn as you race more and more often. Some of those race strategy and tactics that are going to apply no matter what your power profile is. Because you may have world-class sprinting ability, but you may absolutely suck at taking corners. And so you may never be able to be in the position to use that sprinting ability to win the race, because you just always fall off on the corners, or you're always in the wrong position. And sure, you can pass 10 guys, but you started 40th wheel on the final straight, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I've seen this with riders where, I look at their power profile, or I look at their, their specific power file after the end of a race, and I'm looking at all of these different metrics and saying, I don't understand. I can't quite understand why you're producing this amount of power and you're still not able to be competitive in this race. And that gets to the point that you're making, Justin, is that there's a lot to bike racing in terms of, how frequently are you on your brakes? What type of decisions do you make when there's a slowdown in the field? Are you able to effectively and fluidly improve your position without having to produce a bunch of power? And that's, to me, that's a wonderful thing, right? Because for those of us that are, which is the large majority of us, which are pretty mediocre bike racers at the end of the day, the exciting thing about bike racing is that you can have the cold hard reality of a power profile chart, but then you can have all these different elements of confidence and bike handling skills and tactical savviness and or to say nothing of team strength, right? Being on a team where people really work cohesively together. And so you can have all these other elements that you look at it might be that some of you look at the power profile chart and you are like, I suck at pretty much everything, right? And that might be you. But the cool thing about cycling is that doesn't have to define whether or not you can win a bike race, or that doesn't have to define even whether or not you can make a contribution to a win in a bike race on a team. And so that's, again, I've there's a lot of debate on whether or not you should even have category labels on this power profiling, because oftentimes people have this tendency to look at it and be like, oh man, I'm only so-and-so. And if that's you, then don't even use the power profile chart. Just go out and train and have fun. If you can't look at it kind of with more of that more of that context to say, yeah, this says something, but then there's also all those other pieces of bike racing that help to contribute to success.
Absolutely. And I think one other element here is it's also this analysis of your power profile is relative, right? I'm a better time trialist than I am a sprinter when racing against those at my level. You may,
Sure.
and so if you're not racing, if you're in a field that you're a lot stronger, you may be able to still sprint well, even though typically you're a time trialist, or vice versa. The point is, it's all relative to you and those who are at your same level. So knowing the competitive level of the field you're in is also a very a key element to knowing what strategy you should employ, how much teamwork. Something we had a ride with Ivan Dominguez, who's a very well-known sprinter, very, very strong sprinter. And one of the things he mentioned in this ride with was that he just had to relax completely. He knew it was a flat crit. The chances of people getting away off the front in a breakaway were just slim to none. And so he would just essentially tail gun or just sit on the back and just coast. And some people may take off, but he knew the other teams are going to work and everything and bring him back in. And when he needed to move up in positions, you don't try to sprint hard when the field's strung out, but you wait until there's maybe a sit-up point. And then you can move up 40 wheels instantaneously because nobody's expecting that to happen. And so those are things that you learn from having raced often that you're not going to learn that from looking at your power profile chart. But
sure.
But definitely the power profile chart is going to inform those decisions. Ivan did that because he knew he had the power at the end to pull off the sprint win in the right position. So there's a trade-off.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good point, is that he's doing that because he knows that that's an effective strategy to win. That's totally different than the rider who sits in the back and who doesn't utilize their strengths, who doesn't have the ability to win the sprint at the end, right? So that's where I think the power profile chart can kind of help to give you a dose of reality to say, is this an effective strategy to win? Is it not? And it can help maybe, if you're unsure, I think it can at least kind of point you in that direction. And to kind of talk a little bit more about the power profile chart is that you have to remember too that this doesn't take into account fatigue. So there's some WKO4 charts that you can look at that can look at your best efforts after a set amount of fatigue. And in reality, that's probably a little bit better of a look at a realistic picture of this, because your power profile chart, it might not really change all that much over the course of training, but it could be that what changes is your ability to produce near maximal power outputs at the end of a race. So for most of us, these power that our bests that show up on this power profile chart are probably our bests on fresh legs. And it could be that overtraining, our goal is not necessarily to improve our 5-second power, but our goal is to be able to produce that best at the end of a fatiguing race. So there's a lot of different kind of areas for subtlety and nuance when you're looking at these that can help kind of illuminate improvements in your riding. And it's not as cut and dry as just, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses. It takes a little bit of digging into if you really want to use it as a useful tool.
So here's a question, Nate. Let's say I'm that rider who I look at my power profile chart and I have a decent 15-second effort, but I find that at the end of the race, I can never produce that at the right moment in time. And I feel frustrated because I know I can do that, but I'm always too fatigued, or just for whatever reasons, I can't produce it at the right time. What would you suggest to this athlete?
Yeah, and so this kind of gets back to that analogy of a rising tide raises all boats, right? So for riders who are really good sprinters, who find that they can't produce that 15-second power, the most likely observation is that your fitness just isn't that good, and that time invested at improving your FTP, or your power at threshold, is probably going to be your best investment. And that when you spend that time improving your FTP and bumping up that, your ability to produce power sustainably over a race at higher and higher levels, is that you're going to be dipping into that sprint power much less throughout the course of the race, and you're going to preserve, kind of that turbo button, and you might be able to preserve that for when it matters most. And that's really the difference when it comes to, I'd say that's the primary difference when it comes to riders through the USA Cycling categories, is that you can have a Cat 5 rider or beginning racer whose sprint power is maybe even is equal, if not better, than many sprinters in a Cat 1 field, but they're unable to produce that at the end of the race. And as that rider progresses, generally their sprint power really isn't changing a lot. It's probably staying just about the same, but their power at threshold is what changes and improves as they continue to progress through those different levels from Cat 4, 3, 2, and upwards. So that's where I think for most people, if you forgot all of the kind of the nitty gritty of power profiling and strengths and weaknesses, and you just spent time in training and improving your aerobic fitness as measured by your FTP, it'd be hard to make a lot of mistakes. You might not be as good as you could be if you took a little bit more specific look at all the areas of your fitness, but I think you'd be pretty good off, no matter what your strengths or weaknesses are, if that was your primary focus.
Awesome. One, just you mentioned in there about as your FTP rises during those races, you don't dip into your over maximal effort. You're not draining your battery, let's say. But I think the other way I want to phrase that is you also recharge your battery faster, right?
Sure.
Because anytime you're not going above threshold, you're either at or below, and you're basically building up the stores you need to be able to produce that end of the race effort. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead.
Just say real briefly, this is where heart rate, even though a lot of us, we don't look at heart rate a whole lot, but this is where heart rate can be helpful in that illustration, is that, in pretty simple terms, if you're able to ride a criterium or a race with a lower heart rate, chances are, your fitness has probably improved to the degree where you'll be able to produce maximal sprint or close to maximal sprint towards the end of that effort. So that can be another tool to kind of assess, to kind of assess where your fitness is at in relation to being ready to do your best efforts at the end of a race.
Awesome. Well, our time is up today, Nate. We thank you so much for coming on. We always appreciate your insight, all the great content you provide us. If you guys want to hear more about Nate's stuff, datadrivenathlete.com. You can contact him directly at nate@datadrivenathlete.com. Great articles. We've got a blog, newsletter you can sign up for. Plenty of awesome content. Give him a follow. If you like this channel, we've got plenty of video content coming out daily. Later on today at 3:30 p.m. Pacific, we have the Skills and Drills ride, where Coach Ian Murray from Evil Elf Racing hosts the Castelli Skills and Drills ride, where they teach you a lot of these skills and tactics that we talked about, things that you can employ once you understand your strengths and weaknesses. So that's a great ride. Join in there. It's interactive on Discord. And Ian will step you through all sorts of awesome racing strategy tactics. So with that, we are going to sign off, and we will see you on the next episode of What's Up with Power. Thanks, guys.